Nice to have you on board again. And today we are going to talk a little bit of philosophy. Recently, I've been working with my students on some introductions to ethics topics, and I'll maybe post one or two videos on things that we have covered. One of these will be, maybe the first one now will be Mary Midgley's Trying Out One's New Sword. This article is a classic, and often when you approach the topic of moral relativism, you will find it among the recommendations, and many books, anthologies contain it, and for good reason. Midgley was a very popular and very influential philosopher in the UK, and she participated in several important public debates. One of them was what are the similarities and differences between humans and other animals, and just because we are similar, does it follow that there is nothing very special about our ability to decide or our responsibility? Another important area where she had a big effect was to make the British public the reading public, a lot more sensitive to climate change and, in general, environmental protection. She's a big proponent of our duty as humans to take care of the earth and the other creatures that live on it. And she wrote a couple of books where she addresses other broader ethical topics. And so this paper, Trying Out One's New Sword, is an interesting one. The title comes from a story about Japan, which is probably not true if you look at it historically, but it makes for a good story. The story is this. At one point, maybe before the Tokugawa shogunate, maybe perhaps during the Warring States era, there was a rule that people who were born into the samurai class, right, this was, they had a right to cut down commoners, lower ranked people in society. If those people insulted them, they could basically try out their new sword, whether it's sharp enough and fit for combat. They didn't really need much justification for this. Now, again, I don't think this story is quite true. I looked into it one time a little bit, and as fascinating the Middle Ages have been everywhere, it doesn't seem to have been quite this brutal in Japan. But yeah, it's a good story. And the point of the story is, if this story is or would be true, would it mean that Japanese society at that point, when this was allowed, was just so different from Japan today or any other country, the US or Canada or Germany, Hungary, whatever, Morocco, that we wouldn't really stand a chance to understand it? And because we would lack understanding, maybe we would also lack any rational justification to criticize it. Now, some people, especially anthropologists and sociologists, not everyone of course, but some, have pushed the idea that really societies are that different today that we cannot reasonably judge them. We can't reasonably say that what they're doing, some of their practices or values, are wrong or mistaken. Midgley terms this position moral isolationism, and there are two key claims in her formulation. The first claim is that distinct societies, cultures, groups have their own values. Their perspective, therefore, differs so much that we can never come to really understand them. The second one is that, hence, so this is supposed to follow from the first, we cannot judge their values and practices. We cannot say that something done by a person from a different country or culture is wrong or right, or bad or good, because that would be a judgment. And moral judgment is only justified within our own community. The idea here is obviously that the values are specific to a culture. There's no broader foundation for them. Hence, we can only find standards that we apply when we are criticizing practices, values, ways of thought, morally interesting behavior within a culture, because we don't have a universal objective standard. But Midgley thinks this is absolutely mistaken, and one of the things is, often we feel we can learn from other cultures or respect other cultures, and respect is in general a very sensible attitude. But we cannot respect something that we do not understand. So if it is true that we can never really understand another culture, respecting another culture doesn't make sense. Think of an example. There's a person who you don't really understand, you don't know much about their life. You can imagine a celebrity, a politician, a famous business person. And maybe they have one or two very visible actions, policies, art performances. And you're like, wow, those performances, those actions, I like them very much. I think this is a very respectable person. But you don't actually know much about the person, and maybe even if you would know, you lack the imagination or the knowledge or the experience to understand how they made their decisions. This is in politics very common, or also, of course, in other complex fields. And you can't really say that you respect a person because, as long as you don't understand, they might think in ways that you actually find appalling. And even some of the performances or the actions that you are sympathetic to or impressed by, that you would base your respect on, might have motivations, might have been created in ways, might have had consequences that these people endorsed, but you would find morally reprehensible. Think of a songwriter who would use slave labor from, this is a far-fetched toy example, of course, but underpaid people to and overworked people to set up their brilliant show. We respect them a lot less if we know that they made enormous amounts of money to put on this show, they get all the praise, but they didn't pay their employees fairly. Suddenly they're a lot less respectable, right? Or, of course, in business or politics, you can go to a lot of examples that show this. So Midgley certainly does have a point here. Without understanding, there isn't respect. It's not possible. But then again, it's so funny because many anthropologists and other social scientists who would say that we should respect other cultures go on and explain the habits and lives and values and the origins of the traditions of other cultures, and obviously they do understand these exceptionally well, often probably better than the people living in that culture. So it's very funny when the people who say that, well, you can't judge, are actually people who understand that culture exceptionally well. So obviously understanding other cultures is very much possible. And then probably judgment should be possible as well. Whether the judgment is within the value system, framework of that culture, or there's an objective standard for it, that's a separate question. Whether it's fair to say that, I'm judging from an objective point of view, or I know enough about your culture to be able to pass a judgment within your culture. That's two different topics, right? There's also, of course, exchange between cultures. The cultures can learn from each other, correct each other, and so on. If we truly wouldn't be able to judge other cultures, think about slave ownership or colonization. Most of us today think that these practices were quite wrong, obviously. Taking away the freedom of another human being is wrong, and using another country simply as a fodder for resource without any regard for its development and the welfare of its citizens is, of course, wrong. But if we cannot judge other cultures, then, of course, we should not evaluate problematic past behavior either, because culture has changed, right? The mentality that set up in the U.S., the dominance over Central America and South America and the previous century is not exactly the same mentality that the U.S. leadership has today. There have been some significant cultural changes. Same, of course, England changed vastly since it's been a colonial power. Germany changed vastly since it's been a Nazi country, and so on and so on. So if you would think that no criticism can be passed because we cannot understand previous configurations of culture, then we could not be able to reject or judge these former problematic behaviors. And that again shows that one of the consequences of moral realism is very counterintuitive and undermines important social practices, which speaks against moral relativism. It shows that it's probably not a sensible and good position. Midgley, as usually in her books and writings, doesn't offer a very simple solution. She usually picks things apart and tries to show which parts of an idea might be true and which parts we should maybe reject or question. And in this case, she says, of course, it doesn't mean that it's very simple or every judgment about other cultures will be valid. We do need intelligence, we do need good quality information, and we do need maybe experience and a lot of time to make judgments. And, this is very funny living abroad. It becomes very clear very quickly when you talk to people who have moved to a country how they try to interpret exchanges and things that happen to them. But often they apply the standards of their own country, or they feel that their own country is the place where they lived previously. The standards and norms and practices of that place are superior. And if something doesn't work out, they're like, oh, I'm a foreigner, that's why I have troubles. And very often these interpretations are not true, and they are the results of not enough knowledge, not enough experience, or simply not enough energy to deal with processing what's happening to you in a totally new culture. So insightful judgments are not easy to come by. We might have the possibility of such judgment, but that doesn't mean that everyone can make it very easily. And one of the important things is that we need also imagination. Not everyone has good imagination. There are plenty of people who are very efficient in their jobs as whatever, clerks, engineers, marketing specialists, IT, in economics or whatever field, teachers, doctors, but they are very unimaginative people who cannot use their capacities very well to understand things that they're not familiar with extensively. It doesn't mean they're stupid, it's just that one among the many skills making up how we humans function is not that well developed in some people. And it's not a horrible thing, it just means we need that. If we do have that, then we can make reasonable comparisons between cultures and start thinking about which configurations of norms yield better outcomes for general welfare, or raising happy children, or protecting lives, and so on and so on and so on. You can often see this, for example, if there is a fictional country where everyone has guns and there are very extremely high murder rates every year. The murder rates look like in a politically unstable, low-income country, despite this fictional country being a high-income, very developed country. But the people living there cannot imagine living in any other way. There's collective problem with imagining alternatives, and therefore they can't move on, and they keep having these mass shootings and other problems. Entirely fictional, of course. Also, a ban on moral judgment would render society stationary. This is another problem with moral relativism, right? You are not able to advance your own society, since the way a moral relativist pictures things is that society is fairly homogeneous, or at least there's a dominant, clearly dominant, or clearly preferred set of values and norms. And if these cannot be questioned validly, either from the outside or from within the framework of that culture, it's impossible to change and improve the culture. Now, if this would be true, things would not have changed much in the last 10 or 50,000 years of humanity's development, but they have. Of course, we don't live like our ancestor Homo sapiens used to live when it was hunting alongside Homo neanderthalensis in Europe 50,000 years ago, right? Hunting down giant rhinos and other animals. We live very differently, and a lot of that is because we always work on changing our culture, improving our social institutions, changing our imagination about new ways of how we can create things like social insurance, how we can create things like pension systems, how we can create things like railroad systems or electricity grids, and so on and so on and so on. Very often these things are we need engineers and workers to build them, but in the end we need somebody with imagination who can think like, all right, the engineers can do this. We could create such a framework that would benefit many people. That's not an engineering idea, that's a different kind of idea that has to do with being a citizen and using your abilities as a political communal being. If you would not do that, things would never improve or change. Of course, these are all going to be moral judgment. So again, if moral relativism would be true, if we would not be able and we would not have any justification to criticize other cultures, this door would be closed. It's obviously not. So again, this speaks against moral relativism. One more thing that's very important that Midgley notes is that, let's say you talk to someone and there is something you object to in their culture, or they object to something in your culture. In most of these cases, as long as you're a normal, intelligent grown-up, you're going to try to explain to them why that practice or value makes sense. You might explain it in a historical way, pointing to certain contingent, things that just went a certain way, and as a result we ended up with a specific value that served us well during the history we had. Or you might point to certain benefits to society that are not necessarily obvious. If you try to explain things in such a way, you're assuming that the other person can understand you and your reasons make sense to them because you have some shared concerns, maybe with communal benefits, maybe with social stability, maybe with harmony, maybe with individual freedom, whatever kind of values the reasons are connected to that you mention in defense of the practice that you're explaining to someone. Now, this of course cannot work unless human beings understand and really share certain concerns. And you can see that this is so if you think, for example, back to the idea of the story that Midgley mentions in her paper about the samurai testing their swords. In most societies, arbitrary killing of innocent people has been banned for a very, very, very long time, thousands of years going back. If you look at records from India, China, where they've written records going back 3,000-4,000 years, or ancient Egypt, or other societies which were developed, the Sumerians, Persians, Greeks, mostly arbitrary killing of innocent people or torture were banned. It's very important for the stability of the society that these be so. Why would anyone recognize the status of the samurai in the fictional story if they can just go around killing random people? Of course, sooner or later they would be rebellions and people would try to change the way things were because of the risk and the lack of safety and security. The whole point of society is to have those things, besides the things we can create together. So, I think Midgley makes a great case that the idea of moral isolationism or moral relativism is wrong because it assumes a static, unchanging world of separate cultures, but such totally isolated, unchanging units have never really existed. Even what people bring up as examples, if you look at isolated small communities and islands, or say the Japanese society, why the Tokugawa shogunate was ruling and they locked down the island, there were significant and important changes in many things, the laws, the customs, the regulations, and of course, despite the ban on traveling into and out of the country, the shoguns made sure that they themselves and their ruling circles did receive high quality information about the outside world. Many island communities as well, we can say that maybe they don't develop at the speed that highly connected societies did, but there are changes in generations. So go read the paper. It's a very fun paper. The summary is not a substitute for reading and digesting and shaping and forming your own thoughts. It's just supposed to help you to get some of the key ideas and maybe see one not too shabby way of understanding how this paper can be interpreted and worked with. And I'll say goodbye with that to you. Have a great day and take care of yourselves.